episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and make the world a better place. Whether you're in business, issue-based campaigns, or an organisation driving change in your community, Dunn develops strategies to overcome challenges by connecting people that share the same values and organises them to achieve common goals from the ground up. To find out how you can partner with Dunn, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Welcome to episode 14, or maybe 15, I'm losing track, of Socially Democratic, a weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On today's episode, we have the Victorian State Labor Minister for Family Violence, Women and Youth, Gabrielle Williams, and today we're going to talk to her, not just about her actual portfolio, but a little bit about her background as well. Her and I share very similar Celtic heritage, and we thought we'd have a bit of a yak about her background, but in particular, some things that she did that I think would be very interesting to our audiences when she was going through university and doing her honours, and did some stuff around terrorism and a whole bunch of things that relate to all the troubles in the north of Ireland. So that should be a great episode, and I hope you enjoy that. Don't forget that to follow Socially Democratic, make sure that you subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please give us a review and leave a rating. And to keep up to date with all the latest episodes of Socially Democratic, you should follow us on the Dunn social media platforms on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Let's get to this week's episode. Minister Gabrielle Williams, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you for having me.
I have been wanting to do this podcast for a while. A number of our mutual friends in the Labor Party said, you need to interview Gabrielle Williams. And I thought about doing delegating the research role to a very extensive research department at Dunn.
Comprising of one Stephen Donnelly.
Absolutely. And I decided to forgo that because I thought, well, I'm actually going to make the initial part of this podcast the research project.
Okay, good.
Because I think part of the reason why people have suggested, Stephen, you need to interview your good self is because I think they've just obviously identified a shared cultural heritage connection that you and I have. And I thought, well, let's find out about that today.
Sure.
And the great thing about doing these long-form podcasts are that you don't necessarily have to spend the whole time talking about, obviously, your portfolio as a politician or the things that you do every day in your job. And we will do that in this podcast later on. But at the start, I just thought it'd be useful for our listeners to get an idea about who you are and where you came from and your background and some of the things that you've done before you entered into politics. So what is the origin story of Gabrielle Williams then?
No, the origin story, that's always a tough one to fully identify. Well, for starters, I was born in Melbourne, born and raised in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, so I grew up actually originally in Wantirna, so outer east. To a family, my mum was Mulholland, so she was of Irish stock, and my dad is obviously where the Williams comes from, who was from sort of English and Welsh heritage. But we grew up in a tradition which, as I got older, I increasingly realised was kind of very Celtic in its sort of sense of humour and tradition, and obviously growing up as a Catholic too probably contributed to that. So I went through Catholic schools my whole life. My mum's Catholic, my dad's not, and I didn't know Dad wasn't Catholic until I was 16, which is quite hilarious.
Did he keep that from you? Or?
Well, he attended Mass with us, every week, and he just... neither he nor Mum would go up to receive communion, and I just thought it was just something adults didn't do, I later learned that there's a couple of things at play there. There was, I think... when Mum was more devout than she is these days, I think there was a view that she'd sort of committed some kind of mortal sin in marrying a non-Catholic. So I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but she'd probably be horrified to hear me say that. But something akin to that. So I didn't go. But over time, it was just a matter of, well, if she went up, then it would draw attention to the fact that Dad didn't. So neither of them did. And
That's
so I had
hysterical.
so I had no reason to know. And I remember when he just dropped it into conversation when I was a teenager. Like, I was...
Put your seatbelt on, by the way, I'm not Catholic.
Yeah, something like that. I sort of looked at him and said, "What? Hang on, then what are you?" And he looked at me and he said, Church of England, but I'm actually an atheist." So fair play to him for sitting through mass for so many years, with 4 small children. So it was quite controversial when they got married that he wasn't Catholic.
I can imagine.
Yeah, which is, people forget in Australia, I think, that was a thing, and not that long ago, really, that sort of level of controversy. And, the sort of judgment that came from, certainly from elements of his family about the fact that he was, marrying a Catholic woman, marrying down, as they would have seen. There was all sorts of snobbery that attached itself to that. So I sort of realised through our Catholicism and through a strong connection that we had to my mother's side of the family in particular, that there was very much this sort of Celtic tradition running through. Even if they didn't realise it, I don't think my mum realises just how sort of Irish her, so much of the way she operates is, and certainly her sense of humour and the sense of humour of her families and storytelling.
Was she born here in Australia?
She's born here, yeah. So it was actually her grandfather it was my great-grandfather. We've been here for a long time. That sort of, the tradition is hard to shake, I think, when you've come from an Irish Catholic tradition in particular. So much of it just filters through generations, which is probably why when I eventually went there myself and spent significant time there, that I just felt at home, because it was just, all the sort of cultural quirks and the people were just like the people I grew up with, and the things that they did with the things that I did growing up. It was all very, very familiar.
What are some of the things that you did that in growing up that had that cultural connection or that influence? So when I think about it as a child, the Wolf Tones got played a lot in our household, or Foster and Allen when Mum got control of the radiogram. But small things over that journey, like, for Foster and Allen, most of their songs are basically historical content, stories, right? So you hear those songs and then you would ask your parents, what's that all about? So there's an education that happens whilst culturally these things are happening in the background that you don't sort of pay attention to, but then you start to. What were the things that influenced you? Or
my things are more really the way our family operated, almost the matriarchal nature of any family network. Mother at the centre. She always knew what was going on with everyone, and it was a very close family. Everyone always knew. What you'd done on the weekend, or if you'd been in trouble, It was kind of like there was this sort of beating drum kind of tendency among extended family as well. And even so, the construct of the family itself and the way it operated was just very Celtic, I now realise. And then there was sort of the politics. It was the other thing, just how political family life was, and the sorts of discussions that took place, which I realised as I got older weren't the sort of discussions that would take place in other people's families. And there was always, even though the sort of Irish link wasn't always necessarily as overt as, say, the Wolf Tones playing or rebel music, it was later on for me, and I probably educated them on a lot of it. But the politics of Ireland, the politics of discrimination, was very much something that was discussed, and was sort of a part of a intergenerational identity, which I later learned going back to Ireland was very similar there as well. Obviously much closer to them living there, but it was certainly something that was, for me, a part of my childhood growing up and a part of our story as a family.
So both your parents were Labor voters historically?
Yes, yeah. And my mum's uncle was a guy called Ted McCormick, who was president of the Waterside Workers' Federation. So she had sort of multiple generations of political and union activity in her family, which meant that, particularly for me, I'm the youngest of 4 girls, and after a bit of a gap, so she had 3 under 3 very close together, and then a 5-year gap in me, which meant that I spent a lot more time with the adults, listening to their conversations, and particularly when we were at my grandparents' place, that meant a lot of conversations about things that were going on in the union movement or things that were going on in Labor politics at different points in time. And those were just conversations that were run-of-the-mill, which I probably, looking back now, realise the significance of in terms of my own pathway. Interestingly, my sisters wouldn't remember that. They don't think we had an overly political childhood, but that's because they were all playing with each other and I was left in the room with the adults. So it's quite interesting in one family to have very different experiences.
I completely understand what you're talking about there. The gap between myself and my nearest sibling is 9 years.
Oh, wow.
And so, I think it was a mistake. Mum's listening to this right now as well, and she'll be denying that. But
afterthought, not mistake.
Yeah, exactly. Hence why I'm called the golden child amongst my siblings. And their experience with my parents is fundamentally different to the experience that I had with my parents because they'd all moved to Melbourne.
Right.
And so I had my parents all to myself. Yeah. Which I think I was annoying because I would ask lots of questions all the time.
That was me. Yeah.
Right, there you go. So there's another reason why I needed to do this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're the youngest.
I'm the youngest, yeah.
Do you think you are the golden child? Are you considered by the rest of your siblings as the golden child?
No. Oh, probably. Yeah, they'd probably, I often joke these days that it was sort of like growing up with four mothers, having three big sisters. And even now, you sort of, doesn't matter how old I get, I'll still always be their baby sister. So there's still an element of love and care and, and sort of accommodating me. It's quite hilarious. Every time there's a family birthday, a niece or a nephew's birthday, I'll always get a text message from one of my sisters saying, "It's all right, I picked up something for you to give her," or "It's all right," or you can come in with me. Like I'm not capable of doing it myself, which I am. But I think it's just the habit of having done that for a younger sibling your whole life when they're really small. That as you get older, the habit sticks. So I'm perpetually sort of, fighting for my own competency in a family context.
Yeah, okay.
I can do this. I can go to a shop and I can pick out a present.
See, I'm the other way. I've just continued to let that happen. At the tender age of 44, I'm still the child in our family. I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned actually just before that in your later years that you started to immerse yourself more in your own, sort of try and discover your own cultural identity. Tell us how that came about and what was the driver of that.
Yeah, sure. Look, it was ultimately academic. I found myself studying political science at Monash University, and as a part of that was doing quite a lot of work in the counter-terrorism space. Through that work kind of was drawn back to the Irish experience, particularly the conflict in the north of Ireland, and which gave me the opportunity to then do an honours year thesis for it. And quite unusually, I decided that, we came up with a topic. I came up with the topic about, which was essentially a piece around the psychology of terrorism. And at the time there was, it wasn't that long after 9/11. There was all this pathologising of perpetrators of politically motivated violence in the mainstream media, lots of language being used, they're mad, crazy, whatever it was, which I felt and still do feel is quite dangerous because it oversimplifies the complexity of a problem, and it means then if that sort of language infects policy, then you're not actually dealing with those issues in the way that you need to get a genuine and meaningful response that, ultimately builds happy societies. And so I decided in looking at this piece around why people get involved in politically motivated violence and then therefore why they also choose to turn away from it, that the north of Ireland was a great case study. And this was 2004, so it was a few years, it was,
still pretty raw.
It was still pretty raw, and keeping in mind the last prisoners were only released in 2000. I was young, I was 21, so I don't think I fully appreciated back then just how recent it was, but it was a very different place then 15 years ago than it is now, and it was certainly a lot more edgy, and the people I was there to see, and I'll get to that, were certainly in a different stage of their lives than they are now. So fundamentally, I just decided I was going to go over there, and the best way to find out why people got involved was to ask them. It was that simple. I think that raised a few eyebrows at Monash as to why this young woman.
That was my question, actually.
Yeah. I mean, there was sort of, how do you propose to do this? And I kind of thought, oh no, I'll find a way, and and did, and so ended up accessing an ex-prisoner organisation called Coister, and originally they said, look, we'll give you access to one person and one person only. Your project's not a priority, but hey, here's a list of names, and you can choose from them who you might like to speak to. And so I looked at the list of names and did my bit of Google research on each of them. And then one name stood
on NetSpace too.
Yeah. Wasn't, it's very slow research.
Yeah.
Probably could have just gone to the library.
Yeah.
And one name stood out in particular, who was on the 1981 hunger strike. Where 10 men died on that hunger strike. He would have been 11th in line to die. He did 70 days without food, which, if you put that in context, Bobby Sands died at 66 days. So 70 was certainly at the more sort of extreme end in terms of time. And his mother eventually pulled him off the hunger strike, which is why he's alive today. But still has some sort of physical, scars, if you like, health complaints that stem from that time. And so I chose him. I thought, that would be an interesting
Why did you choose him out of that list?
I suppose because he was, so close and seminally involved in a moment in history that I think globally was really significant. I mean, the fact that you've got a Bobby Sands Street in Tehran,
Yep.
this was a moment in history that I think really resonated with people around the world. And I remember for my family, in various political conversations, my mum talking about just listening to the radio every day in 81 to hear how things were going, and going through that journey of just desperately hoping something would happen so these men weren't dying on hunger strike. She found it really gruelling as a person of Irish heritage, just watching this day in, day out, and feeling that there was a real cruelty to all of it.
It's also the first time that the political path of Irish republicanism was uncovered or discovered or realised that there is an opportunity here down that path.
Where it was overt, because of course they ran Bobby Sands for Parliament while he was on hunger strike after the death of, I think the MP that died was it Frank Maguire? I think his name was,
he was a SDLP.
SDLP, MP, and I think quite well liked, well respected, but him passing away in the middle of the hunger strike and then giving Bobby the chance to run
and get elected,
was really changed a lot of things. And I remember speaking to my family here and them saying, there was this sense of elation when he won that election, just because they thought it would save his life. Everyone thought it'd be over. You couldn't, you couldn't let
you're an MP now.
You're an MP now. That's right. It's all going to end, and this the whole kind of cruel episode, will be over. And sadly, we know from history that that's not what happened. Bobby died, 9 more died after him, and there was... So, given his involvement in that, he was, I thought that he would be an interesting voice. He was also sort of at the time sort of actively tied up and trying to find the Columbia Three, who were those 3 former prisoners who were in Colombia. I think they were claiming at the time, my memory might be a bit off, but I think they were claiming that they were... or their version of events was that they were there to oversee the peace process between the FARC guerrilla rebels and the Colombian administration, and then they got picked up and accused of training terrorists, which they to this day insist they weren't doing, and then thrown in jail, and then they went missing. So he was still quite involved in a lot of the ex-prisoner community and peace building work, and was also a playwright and and had written co-written a film with a guy called Brian Campbell. So he had a lot of creative projects that he was doing, which made him quite unusual. He had a PhD, which also made him very unusual, that he got after he got out of jail. He was just an interesting character in his own right, and someone who was able to, I suppose, articulate his own story and the political context of that story well, which for an interview is perfect. Yep. So I got my one interview with the one person that they allowed me access to, and then after that interview was done, he sort of said, "Did you want to speak to some other people? I'll hook you in." And then one turned into kind of 10, and,
wow.
And then all of a sudden, I was, sort of effectively meeting with some of the highest profile, in some cases, ex-prisoners in the north of Ireland. So was an incredible experience, and one that probably was contributed to this sense of connection to my own history and heritage, particularly when ultimately you were talking to people about their experience of discrimination and structural discrimination that was present in Northern Ireland in that sort of leading up to 69 period. And how personally, I guess, that was felt, because so many of the stories that they were telling me were resonating with me because of stories I'd heard from my own family. For example, my mum and my grandmother didn't ever buy sanitarium products. They weren't allowed in our household because sanitarium didn't employ Catholics. Had a policy. And that was in Australia. I mean, and yet I was hearing to a much greater and more dramatic extent from these people in the north of Ireland about, blatantly discriminatory employment practices. The biggest working class employer in Belfast being Harlan Wolff, I think it was about 14,000 employees. They had a no Catholic policy. I was seeing ads in newspapers that had, like every ad just about in the newspapers from that time had Catholics need not apply. You were shut out of the police force, out of most kind of public sector workforces.
Access to housing,
gerrymandering, like blatant gerrymandering. You were, and electoral rules which were deliberately designed to disenfranchise Catholics. So you could only have, I think it was 2 adults in any household, might have been more in any household over the age of 18 voting. Well, when you've got a really large family, whereas most Catholics tended to, and you might have 10 kids and 5 of them might be over the age of 18, well, their votes were effectively being excluded.
Famously, the Derry City Council, which the town of Derry, I think population-wise, was split 60-40 in favour of the nationalist community. Yeah. Yet only returned 3 out of 17, I think, on the council.
Yeah, that's right. And that was happening all over the place, and very deliberate attempts to shut one half of the community out, politically, which, and then, of course, that you got a very firm view about this being a significant civil rights issue, which was how people were seeing it for a large period of time, really, until Bloody Sunday, when all of a sudden, a bunch of university students leading a civil rights march, were effectively shot down by the paratroopers, and which changed the conflict significantly and turned it into a very, very bloody one. Much to the it was a great tragedy, I think, and a very, very long tragedy. 30 years of warfare and death and destruction and trauma, which the community is still recovering from now. But hearing those stories and being able to draw some level of comparison and think, this is a story of my forebears in many ways, and it was to a much lesser extent still the story of some Catholics even in Australia at different points in time, as I said, to a much lesser extent. But it was hard not to feel some sort of cultural connection with this place. But even aside from all of that, I just fell in love with Belfast. It was just such an amazing place, and if you're a political person, it was such a politically charged environment. You'd hear kids talking about politics, like it was in the street, and you think, this is unusual. Everybody was so plugged in.
It's a highly engaged environment.
Highly engaged, in a way that I suppose only societies impacted by conflict can be. They're the ones that tend to, it's such a high-stakes game. People have suffered so much. So, and I think there's this awareness that, what happens at a political level is just so very important because, they've lived it. It's life and death in some of these situations.
When you were interviewing the hunger striker, did you ask him about, because his mother took him off the strike, what was his feelings towards his mother at the time and then over time? I'm assuming she's not with us today.
No, she's not. It's a question that he often gets asked, and I'm always reluctant to answer it for him. But his own comments about it are sort of readily available. But he had no ill feeling towards his mother for taking him off. In fact, he tells this story about it must have been when he was. I might get my timing slightly right, and I'm sure he'll correct me if he ever was to listen to this. But I think it was about day 68, and they call your family in because you're effectively close to falling into a coma and passing away ultimately. And his father, brother and sister all begged him to come off the hunger strike, but his mother never did, never made the ask. But what she did say to him was, and it might have been, as they were on that, I think it was on that day, but she said to him, "You've got to do what you've got to do, son, and I've got to do what I've got to do." And so that was, effectively, if the decision was going to come to her, she was very clear about what she had to do, and she wasn't going to let her son die. They were not a Republican family, I should say, as well.
Right.
So, no, which many of them didn't come from Republican families. There's sort of this assumption that everyone must have been steeped in a deeply political family environment to inspire them to then, join a paramilitary, and that wasn't the case. So it was quite an unusual thing for his family to, I guess, watch that, watch him go down the pathway that he did, but probably also puts into perspective his mother's decision as well. So he was also very close to his mother. I asked him that same question when I interviewed him 15 years ago. It's the obvious question, isn't it? No, and he said no, he didn't have any ill feeling towards her. He fully understood why she had to do what she did, and he adored her. He just thought she was wonderful. She died a couple of years after the hunger strike while he was still in jail. So he never really got to have any kind of meaningful conversation with her, which is quite sad from an interpersonal perspective for anyone with their parents to be in that position.
Fast forward to 2019, and I think you just recently were back in Ireland. A couple of months ago, as was I actually, over the Christmas break.
Yeah, I saw your photos.
Thought we'd go and experience the best of Irish winter.
Yeah, good.
Because it's no different to the summer.
Makes for good whiskey drinking.
Yeah, it does actually, which we tick that bucket. Just walking around the streets of Belfast, last time I was there was 2003.
Yeah.
And going back years later.
Very different.
Yeah. What were the things that jumped out at you? Sort of said, here's some things that have changed, but here are some things that are still the same.
It's so much more cosmopolitan than it was. The tourism industry's really taken off. It's that
Game of Thrones.
I was just about to say the global phenomena that is Game of Thrones has kind of transformed it. You've got things like Titanic Museum and there's quite a lot of development going on there too. So I think it's kind of opened itself up to the world now. The fact that they get tourists now. I mean, you would know from 2003, no one went to Belfast. It wasn't a destination of choice. No. It was still very much a community, a society in the immediate aftermath of a serious conflict. So, and it had that feel about it. It just is. It feels different now. I mean, I don't know if you managed to get to the Cathedral Quarter when you were there at all, but there's all this, there's all these funky bars and restaurants have cropped up.
Yeah.
There's cafes. 15 years ago, try getting a coffee in Belfast. It just wasn't a thing. You know, and people didn't go out for dinner, so there was barely any restaurants. There was Morn Seafoods and. Which was just next to Kelly Cellars or just down the road from Kelly Cellars, which is one of my favourite watering holes there. And that was sort of, and a couple of like Chinese restaurants, Chinese takeaways where, you got Chinese food with mushy peas.
Yeah.
What is that? Anyways,
mushy peas goes with everything.
I disagree. I don't think mushy peas belong with anything. That's the most controversial thing I'm going to say in this podcast. So I mean, it's changed enormously, but probably and you'd be the same, I imagine, given your interest in politics, was how much the younger generation. You've got to remember the generation that voted in the last sort of couple of elections have not lived in a time of conflict. And we've seen that change, I think, the electoral situation there as well. So you've now got the younger generation voting. They were born post-98, post-Good Friday Agreement. They don't remember. They have no living memory of the conflict. Sure, they've heard the stories. They've certainly heard the songs because it's such a big part of Irish culture and the way that they tell their story through music. But they were more concerned. A lot of the debate had moved on from nationalist versus unionist or loyalist versus Republican, that kind of dichotomy, to cost of living pressures, to jobs, to suicide rates, and that's the interesting thing. So you saw, a few years ago in West Belfast, Sinn Féin lost a seat to People Before Profit. and
which have been unheard of.
Yeah, unheard of. It was in Republican heartland, and all of a sudden they've lost. And and it was essentially in that time of sort of anti-austerity, and people were actually talking about the economy and as I said, jobs and cost of living and pressures that were just peacetime problems. And so you've had to see the political leadership and the party spectrum shift to be able to be more well versed in those issues now as well. So it sort of changed the political landscape quite considerably. At the same time, you've got these emerging issues like a growing suicide rate. And when I was last there, a friend of mine there was saying to me they'd lost, and I've been meaning to check this statistic, but I've heard it a couple of times now since from people there who've been working in the community sector there, say to me they've lost more people in suicide since the end of the Troubles than they did from deaths in the Troubles.
Wow.
Which is an alarming stat, because I think they lost a bit over 3,000 over the course of the Troubles, which means they've lost more than 3,000 people since 1998 by suicide in Northern Ireland for a population that's only, 1.5 million roughly.
If that.
Yeah, that's quite frightening, and it's giving them cause to think about what's driving that.
And is that amongst young people, or is it not discriminating against sort of genders or age brackets?
It seems to be, from what I could tell when I was there, men, not just young men though, some sort of middle-aged men as well.
Yep.
So it is. It does sort of shine a light on those sort of day-to-day pressures that I think people are feeling, and it's still a very high unemployment rate in Northern Ireland, which worries a lot of people, because that's when you start getting that sort of feeling of disenfranchisement and what that leads to, and that concern from those, especially from those who were formerly involved in the Troubles in a combatant sense. So members of paramilitaries, they seem to be the one talking about this the most. This concern about young people being effectively kind of sucked in by dissident groups and told that the reason they don't have a job is because of X, and that the solution is to join a dissident group and to kick off the Troubles again, which no one wants to see. But it's very alarming, and as we saw recently with the murder of Lyra McKee in Derry, there has been a surge in dissident activity around Derry in particular, which has got a lot of people concerned.
And for the listeners at home, Lyra was a young journalist. Yeah.
Yeah.
When we were in Dublin and we're heading up to the north, that car bomb went off out the front of the court in Derry. And we were having dinner with a Labor Party colleague for the Irish Labor Party at the time, and I sort of asked her of her thoughts on what was going on, and she was just, the biggest concern that is happening right now, and this is a segue into the next topic of the conversation, was Brexit.
Yep.
They're super worried about what Brexit will do to not just, broadly speaking, the Irish economy, but also this problem that we have with the border.
The border, yeah.
And what my partner remarked to me at the time, when the Brexit debate was happening in 2016, particularly, and it was a very London or more so a very English-centric debate.
Yes.
No one, certainly in the London establishment and the media, the British media, even sort of raised what would happen if Brexit happened.
Yeah.
What is going to happen? No one sort of sat down and said, well, what's going to go on with the border across the Irish Sea?
Yeah.
And maybe even still today, I don't think a lot of people outside of Britain are talking about Brexit and the implications it's going to have on Irish unity or peace. However, and I know you would have noticed this as well, whether you're in the Republic or you're in the North, that is the number one thing that is dominating the front page of the papers and the nightly news is Brexit and the implications it's going to have.
Absolutely, every day. It's headlines every day.
So I just wanted to get your thoughts on Brexit and what were your takeaways whilst you were over there, just sort of reading up on it?
Yeah, look, it's as you outlined, it's at the front of everybody's mind, both I think in the Republic and in the North. Given I spend most of my time in the North when I am there, I think the fear is, there's obviously those broader economic concerns about what a border, what the implications of a border are, but there's that. I think that perhaps the rest of the world doesn't also understand the psychological impact of reinstating a border there. Most people that live particularly in the north or in any of those border areas have very, very sort of traumatic memories of there being a border there, and what that meant for movement across, but also, guards and police and military and all those sorts of things, that presence there at the border when that sort of dissipated, when the border was sort of essentially deconstructed post Good Friday, allowing more free movement. It was kind of emblematic of peace. So to talk about reinstating that even in the psyche of a people, it's very, very significant. And I'm not sure even that was really, or I'm still not sure that it is really understood, the sorts of fears that ends up sparking in people. The concern about a return to violence, also not helped by that dissident activity that we were just talking about. You're seeing a rise in dissident activity, you're seeing the prospect of a border being reinstated, which for many, strikes fear in their hearts, and then the potential economic impacts as well. Ironically, there's also another view that's occasionally put forward, which is, Brexit might be the one thing that fast tracks a united Ireland for those who want to take for those Republicans who want to take an optimistic view. Of course, for loyalists in the north, that's also a worry. So they're worried on multiple fronts. What if it is what pushes Northern Ireland into becoming a part of that broader republic? That they're concerned about that. Others, Republicans, might be those who want to be optimistic about it, but overwhelmingly, those are sort of still fringe arguments. It's that concern about what that means about whether a return to violence is made more likely through that activity, which, you're right, was never a part of the original discussion. So it was never really a discussion about how Brexit had an impact out of England itself. And you've seen the Irish government take some pretty, make some pretty bold statements about what they're prepared to accept and what they're not, particularly around sort of border policing at ports, etc. They were pretty blunt in.
Well, it's interesting seeing how the European Union or the leadership in Brussels have handled these negotiations with the British government, because they've basically given the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, a seat at that table and said, basically, you lead the negotiations, because this is actually going to have a bigger impact on you than it is largely. It's not great for us in Europe in general.
No.
But Ireland have a seat at that table.
Yes, and so they should, because it does have a disproportionate impact on them. It is the the border between Europe and the UK post Brexit. So Ireland absolutely should have a seat at that table, and I think they've, as I said, been pretty blunt with what they're prepared to do, or rather not prepared to do, in order to make that work. And I know in the last couple of days there's been articles. Sort of, I think the suggestion is there's sort of leaked analysis by the British government about what the chances are of a hard border Brexit and what the implications of that are. And the suggestion is, by their own analysis, it's not a good story, and maybe a greater possibility than what they've publicly been saying. So I have no doubt that at the moment the anxiety about that is growing, not abating. So we'll see how Johnson responds to that in coming days and weeks.
And we can talk about that forever as well. You can do a whole podcast on it. Let's turn to matters a little bit more closer to home. You're a minister now in the Daniel Andrews Labor government.
Yes.
You're elected in the 2014 election. Just before we talk a bit more about your actual role and your portfolios, can you think of a key moment in your Labor journey in which, if you had not have done that, you wouldn't be here today?
A key moment in my Labor journey? I probably can. It was... I never had any great ambitions. I should preface this by saying I never had any great ambitions to be an elected representative. I loved, obviously highly political, loved the Labor Party and the Labor movement. I had worked in and out of it at both state and federal level, and really enjoyed those back of house, behind the scenes roles and policy work and the politics involved in party operations, but never particularly saw myself as being an elected representative. I think the turning point there was going to work for Alan Griffin, and this conversation that we had around where effectively he said to me one day, would you be interested in running? And I just immediately said no. Like, it just came out of my mouth. Before he'd even got the sentence out, I just knocked it on the head, and he sort of looked at me with this confused face, I think because my answer had been so unequivocal. And he said, well, you know, I'm going to go and get myself a coffee, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you that question again. And so we just walked out of the room, and I remember thinking, this is weird, you know, why? It sort of forced me to have to think about it. And then when he came back, he said, you know, let's unpack that. Why did you respond that way? Why so forcefully? And by the time we discussed it and got to the end of that conversation, he said, so what you're telling me is it's fear that's made you respond that way. And I said, well, yeah, you know, good a reason as any. And he said, oh, well, that's no reason not to do something. And it was kind of that idea of why, you know, of questioning, of saying why not. And I think this is, you know, it probably ties into my portfolios a bit, but I do think there is a tendency by women in particular to automatically defer to somebody else and assume that they're more competent, that they're better placed to be able to do that role or to, you know, engage in that task, whatever it might be. Tend to stand back and let others stand forward or step forward. And I was certainly guilty of that repeatedly. And that was probably the first time I was probably made overtly aware of the fact that that's what I was doing, but also was kind of asked the question, well, why not you?
What mental processes did you then have to go through to address that fear?
I'm still going through them. I don't know that you ever get over it. Yeah. You know, I think it's little things like making sure that, you know, if you have an idea, if you're around a table, even if it's with your cabinet colleagues or your parliamentary colleagues, and there's a discussion happening and you have an idea, it's working up the courage to just verbalise it sometimes, you know, and convincing yourself that you have a right to give your opinion. And in fact, that's why you're there. Yeah. You're there to share your view and share your opinion. And it's, you know, it's all individual incidents and opportunities, and just making yourself take them rather than just let them pass you by. And so, you know, comfort builds over time, I guess. But I do think it's something we probably don't speak about enough. Yeah. You know, our public personas are of these people with enormous and extreme confidence, but often, you know, what happens underneath the surface is you know, does not match the public expression of ourselves that people would see. Yeah.
It's funny, actually. I kind of worked that out at one stage in my union and political career, that it's actually okay in meetings to say, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone wants to be seen, I must look like an idiot if I don't know the answer to that.
Or ask a question. Yeah. I actually still believe this. The most valuable person in any room is the person that asks a lot of questions, even though they might be the person that people eye roll about. They're always the most valuable person, because 9 times out of 10 they're asking questions that everyone else wants to know the answer to, but isn't brave enough to ask.
So glad Gabrielle asked that question.
I know. And I'll be freely admit that I'm not always the person asking the questions. I'm sometimes the person that's sitting there thinking, thank God they asked that, you know, because I've been wondering that too. Yep. And, you know, and sometimes it's a silly thing, like, you know, and I've seen this happen where it could be a basic question, for example, what does that acronym stand for? Yeah. And then someone answers it, and you see like palpable relief across the faces of everybody around that table, because nobody knew what that acronym stood for. Yeah. You know, like it's things like that. You know, you sort of realise that.
Having set up my own business and moving to a new sort of set of circles, and I've just been hit in the face with a whole bunch of new acronyms. And
and you've got to ask. Oh, yeah. You know, it can be very, very, you know, the outcome can be potentially disastrous if you go off making assumptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're now the minister for a number of portfolios, including family violence,
yes,
women and youth. Key portfolios for an Andrews Labor government.
Yes.
Let's start with family violence. Obviously, we had the Royal Commission in the last term, and all of the recommendations that were handed down, the Andrews government are going to implement.
Yes.
Talk us through some of the bigger ones that you've prioritised in your first stint as the minister for.
Yeah. Well, for starters, the reform itself is huge, and I don't think we've often reflect enough on the fact that it's world leading. It's not just nation leading. We have jurisdictions around the world who are watching us very closely at the moment, and who are looking to learn the lessons from from the work that we're embarking upon, and looking to us to also build the evidence base around things, which was a big part of the Royal Commission report and its findings. In terms of some of the biggest reforms that I've been working on and will continue to prioritise, I mean, I suppose the biggest and one of the most visible ones is the rollout of the Orange Door, our support and safety hubs. We committed to 17 of those across Victoria, and these are effectively hubs that bring together core services to make sure that predominantly women and children that are impacted by family violence are getting the support they need, but when they need it as well. So this is effectively about closing gaps. You know, the Royal Commission was pretty scathing in its assessment of just how fractured and uncoordinated the system was, and the fact that left vulnerable people open to just slipping between the cracks and not getting the help they need, or not getting the help they need when they needed it, which can be extraordinarily dangerous in situations of extreme family violence. So it was this is a new way of operating, and it's not just about the hub itself. It's actually about the network that it builds around it. It's about making sure that there is no wrong door, that no matter where a woman turns up to in the service system, that she's connected into the other services she needs. So, the ultimate vision of our reform is that, whether you turn up to a hospital, to a dentist, to a specialist service, or you name it, that you are effectively then plugged in through an Orange Door network to the help that you need when you need it. So these are really complex. It's a really complex part of the reform, because you're fundamentally asking different parts of the sector to work differently. They've been so used to working in silos over time, and now we're asking them to work together. We've got children and family services literally sitting next to a specialist family violence service and a perpetrator intervention sort of related service, whether that be men's behaviour change or whatever. Obviously also working hand in glove with police, and then with the universal service system as well. So it's a very complex system to have working well. So that's, getting that right is really important. We've got 5 hubs rolled out so far. We've got another few on the way, and overall, by the end of this term, we'll have all 17 underway.
Both Metro and in regional Victoria? Metro
and regional Victoria, and each of the other, which also highlights, I guess, the beauty of the model, or the value of the model, being that while obviously we want consistency of quality across all 17 sites and regions, we also want them to reflect that the communities in which they're embedded. So we know that there's particular challenges in a rural and regional community that there won't be in a metro community, and similarly there's some unique challenges in metro communities and in certain metro communities, and there will be in others. So it's really important that the hub itself reflect that and address it, which I think is also the strength of the model. It's, that sort of place-based way of thinking. And we know that particularly for women and children in rural and regional Victoria that are often experiencing these issues, there's, the challenge of the tyranny of distance is obviously a big one, of often a much thinner service system, so, fewer options available to people in terms of the sorts of services that are often based in these areas, and a range of other challenges that mean, we need to manage risk, I guess, in a slightly different way in those areas than we would in others, or, lean on different networks.
Yep. The area of women, you have you and your department have overseen an ad that came out just recently about I guess it's calling out sexual harassment in public spaces.
Yep.
The ad has a guy who's a little bit creepy and leery
yes.
on a tram. And then another bloke sort of staring at a woman, another bloke sort of stands in the way, and the guy kind of gives him the, what are you doing, you dickhead?
Yeah.
That really good ad, very effective ad. Talk us through the development of that, and then the follow-up question is, it seemed to be quite controversial, and I don't understand why, but maybe you can explain to us.
Yeah. Oh, God, I wish I understood too. So that ad is the second phase. The ad you're talking about, which takes place on the train, is a part of the Respect Women Call It Out campaign. That's phase 2. Phase 1, people might remember, was the ad that had the handful of guys sitting around a table, and then one of them answers a call from his girlfriend, you assume, and he speaks to her quite terribly. And the ad focuses on the sort of internal monologue of one of his friends who kind of notices that he's spoken to his girlfriend terribly and notes it thinks about whether he should say anything, then kind of thinks, it's sort of not my business, so no, I won't. And then in the end, gently kind of says, yeah, that's not okay. And it's just they're quite low entry points, but that's the whole point about any ad campaign that is about bystander intervention. We don't want people rolling up their sleeves and getting into fights in public spaces. That's not what we're going for. But we are also trying to send a very clear message that we have a collective responsibility for people's safety in public spaces, and particularly around this issue of women's safety in community spaces, public spaces, whether that be, public spaces or inside their own homes, and that it also points to the fact that violence against women is a cultural issue that everybody has to be a part of changing. So that latest ad on the train, which you've adequately described, was controversial. I don't really understand why it was either, but it brought out those voices that raise the kind of, oh, great, so we're not allowed to look at women anymore, which is bizarre, because obviously the logical response to that is, well, no, you're not allowed to leer or stare at women in a way that makes people feel uncomfortable. That's all we're asking you to do. We're asking you to treat another human being with respect, and it's basically that simple. I think it's, when you've got voices like Mark Latham's joining the fray, and we've become very accustomed to him, joining the fray on issues like this. He was one of those men that was saying really outrageous things in response to the ad. I think his comment was, the guy might just be looking at her thinking, did I root her at uni? That's what he said. That was his response.
I read that.
Yeah, and it sort of, quite frankly, it just made Latham a walking billboard for why we needed the ad campaign in the first place. It just proved the point. He didn't seem to understand the irony of that, the fact that his own comments were justifying our investment very, very soundly, and he promptly sort of jumped onto social media and trolled me for a while as well.
I heard this.
Yes. Yeah, which is...
Was there a back and forth, or did you just sort of think, I'm just going to let that
I think I responded to one, and then you just realise that, he's just, he's preaching to his own choir, and there was no value in engaging him on it. I think the ad speaks for itself and stands on its own 2 feet, and to be honest, I kind of got to the point where I thought, no, we let the ad do the talking, because I think it has been incredibly effective. The reach of those ads has been just phenomenal.
It's good.
The latest data I saw, we're about to get a new set, but from that last one was that half of Victorians over the age of 18 had seen it already, and that was a little while ago now. So, we know that not only is the reach huge, that people are understanding the message that sits behind the ad and are able to articulate what it's trying to say and what it's trying to do, which again is, for anyone, in trying to get a message out, it's exactly what you want. For people to be able to understand and walk away with a very clear sense of what their expectation of them is. So ultimately, we're always going to, in issues around gender equality, around changing cultures, you're always going to have voices that have been in, at the more privileged, typically, end of the spectrum, in terms of, they've been able to get away with behaviour that we're trying to stop for a long time, and so naturally they feel like they're losing something out of it. I've got to say, this whole idea around gender equality, that, Latham isn't alone in some of the concerns, if you like, that he was raising. He might have been more blunt and crude with the kind of, point he was trying to put forward. But, we've had others in our political spectrum, the Prime Minister being one of them, who made remarks, I think it was on International Women's Day, about, of course we want equality for women just as long as it doesn't come at anyone else's expense. So what he was effectively saying is, women can be equal, but men aren't giving up anything, it was this kind of, which when you think about it it's absurd. It's just an absurd statement to make. So, yes, he wasn't as crass as Latham, but we do still have these voices that feel deeply uncomfortable about any discussion around cultural change, particularly discussions that effectively go to gender equality. And I think we'll continue to have to encounter those. But, I've got a lot of faith in the younger generation too, that things change generationally. A lot of, if you look at, some of the commentators and, who are in the sort of Mark Latham kind of end of this spectrum, they tend to be white men of a certain age often. So, you'd have to hope that over time those voices start to become less relevant, and I think they already are.
Yeah. You feel like they're projecting in some ways about their own status.
Oh, absolutely.
And their own place in the world.
Yeah.
We think about it, Mark Latham, my God. I just...
What a career journey, hey?
Oh, yeah, it really is. Like, I mean, I don't want to draw you in on any comments if you don't want to, but I just sort of think... I was thinking about this morning when we were doing sort of getting ready for this interview. I just thought, Mark, I love tradition, and I think one of the great traditions of the Labor Party is that in Canberra, in the federal caucus room, there are a photo portrait of every leader of the Labor Party since Federation. And Mark Latham's up on that wall amongst some great, unfortunately, mostly men. And you can't take that down, but wow.
Yeah. I think any member of the Labor movement has a level of discomfort about that, and I think it, wonders what happened.
Yeah.
Was he always like this? Was it a change? They're the questions that seem to fly around all the time in relation to him.
Years ago, when he was the opposition education spokesperson under the Beazley leadership period, he came out to Latrobe University, to the Latrobe Labour Club, and I remember he came and spoke to the Latrobe Labour Club. There was about 20 of us there on education. Right. And it was at the Union Bar, and when it finished, he sort of got up and walked off, and we all looked at each other, and we all went, is he crazy? Because his grasp...
Well, you've answered the question then, clearly.
Like I said, his grasp of education portfolio was poor.
Right.
And I know that we're all, student politics, wankers, and we all thought we knew everything. But just, there was a couple of there I was like, I'm not sure if he's the full clue.
And I've heard other similar stories of people say, no, there was, there were plenty of signs, even during his time in federal parliament, that he was an unusual operator, to put it politely. But to see him latch on to the kind of, to see him as a part of one nation, full stop, it's just appalling. But to see him latch on to fringe issues and run them the way he does, and to become this kind of shock jock voice in Australian politics is just really disappointing. And you do have moments where you start to wonder whether he actually believes it himself. You do. I do. I every now and then think, is he just doing this because it gives him an audience? Or are these core
values here that he's driving? I know.
That's right. Or are these genuinely held views? And I'm just not sure. I haven't worked it out yet. And look, I've got no interest in getting to know the guy to a level where I can work that out. No, I don't need to.
Let's just get busy doing good things for our community. Look, let's last couple of questions to wrap it up. We had Jamila Rizvi on a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about, it was actually during the World Cup, the FIFA World Cup, Women's World Cup. Matildas hadn't played their first game yet, and I want to talk to you a bit about that in a moment. But we talked about equal pay.
Yep.
And I just want to get your thoughts on pay equity, and the role that government can play in that space to level that wage playing field.
Yep.
Pardon the pun.
Yeah, well, happy to talk about that. Obviously, it's a big part of our gender equality piece as a state government. We've, I think, been quite bold in our work in this space, and in our statement of our expectations too about not only representation of women, but in addressing some of those sort of structural barriers that lead to bad outcomes for women. Obviously, we talk about that a lot. Bad attitudes towards women lead to bad outcomes for women, and you'll hear that said often in the family violence space. But it's as relevant in terms of how we regard women in a whole range of different settings, and the outcomes beyond just violence, but to their financial security and retirement, their career progression, all those issues that we know there is huge inequality in. We'll later this year be introducing into Parliament a gender equality bill, which will govern sort of public sector bodies and effectively hold them to account on a series of measures around gender equality being, representation of women organisation-wide.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to see a continuation of that phenomena that we know exists, which is, sure, half of our organisation is women, but they're all in the lowest paid jobs.
Mm-hmm.
No, we want to see more an even spread of women across positions, including leadership positions, but genuine progression. We want to see those workplaces, develop mechanisms and tools that mean that the workplace is more accommodating of women, so flexible work, arrangements and the like that allow women to be in the workforce and a part of the workforce even when they're having to go, through, or take career breaks for child rearing, etc. Things that encourage men to take more responsibility for some of those care duties as well. It's not just about what you're doing for women; it's also about what you're encouraging men to do, and a whole range of other things. So it's actually front of mind about how these workplaces operate and how we're actually promoting and encouraging women in those spaces, which also goes to addressing things like the gender pay gap through those mechanisms and addressing addressing the financial disadvantage that we know so many women find themselves in, particularly when it comes to retirement. We've all heard the stats around women's superannuation versus men's superannuation, and we're in a time where it shouldn't. Your game plan for financial security as a woman shouldn't be who you marry, we're well beyond that. So we need to make sure that we're actually, empowering, enabling women to have the same financial security as their male counterparts, So, there's a lot of work going, and we're leading by example fundamentally.
Yep. Here in Victoria.
Here in Victoria, absolutely. But there's a lot more work to do on this space, and particularly in the private sphere. It's, a lot of what we're doing is also trying to, encourage better practices out there in the private sphere. And, I was a lawyer in a past life, and I've seen the structure of law firms, and it's always was just so disheartening to see so many young women at graduate level and junior levels in the firm, and then look at the partnership and
just chock-a-full
it was all men. And that's just one example, but this is everywhere in our community at the moment, and it needs to be different. And going to your conversation with Jamila around sport, I mean, we've seen just how popular AFLW's been. The level of engagement from little girls now in AFL. How popular women's football has become on the back of AFLW too. It's just gone gangbusters. And which does open up that conversation again about, we've got more women at a community level participating in this. We've got an elite level competition now, where it's popular. It's providing great role models for not just little girls, but boys too. Yep. And you've got to remember how important that is. And hopefully culturally this is all leading to a greater acceptance of women's sport as well. Yeah. But the controversial question that always lingers behind all of that is pay. And the fact that our female athletes are still, across sports, still paid way below what their male counterparts are. And it is something that we need to confront, just as we would, pay gaps in any other industry.
Well, strength to your arm in that journey over the next 4 years anyway.
Yes, it's not an easy one.
No, I know, you've got a big mountain to climb there, but I have faith in both your abilities and the abilities of all the people in the Andrews government, certainly leading by example, so we wish you the best of luck. And thanks very much for your time on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.